Kia ora everyone, my name's Kate Dawkings. I'm an engineer at Tauranga City Council in Claudia's team of Water Strategy and Planning. We look after the forward planning of waters infrastructure and also some of the strategic work and support other departments around the council with water related issues. So one of the matters that we're dealing with at the moment is supporting the city planning team with the plan change that they're working on to the Tauranga City Plan. And that plan change is proposed to look at flooding related from intense rainfall events. Obviously there's a lot more to water, as we've been talking about today, but that is particularly looking at extreme intense rainfall events. So there is a plan change proposed to the city plan to address that, Plan Change 27, and we've been working to support that. So I've been asked to talk you through a little introduction to that plan change today. I didn't really want to talk about what we're doing at the moment without acknowledging all of the work that's been done to date on flood planning, particularly by a lot of people in the room as well. So I just wanted to give a quick summary of what's happened to date. And there's been a lot of history of flood planning in Tauranga, and punctuated by some recent flood events as well. So Tauranga experienced some flooding back in 2005. We've got some great pictures of it from some aeroplanes that went up and took photographs. One of the things that led to was the development of rainfall patterns and profiles to use across Tauranga, and at that time it included climate change as well, climate change predictions to 2055. So those are the rainfalls that are still in use across our standards and planning. There was some further flooding in 2013, and that in the aftermath has involved a lot of people in the room, council staff and consultants as well, and led to the integrated stormwater project, which had many work streams looking at the planning for future events and understanding the flood hazard across Tauranga. One of the work streams that came out of that was a large model build process of flood models across Tauranga, and that led to the building of 19 different catchment models, which has been a process of a number of years. And we now have that tool that can be used across the city for understanding where flood risk is, and importantly now how we use those tools in our future planning. So part of using that was an effort to map flooding, existing flood risk across Tauranga, or existing flooding across Tauranga. This is an example on the left there of flood depth maps that have been produced across the city, and there was a very large amount of work done by my colleagues in mapping that, providing information to the public. This is all available on our website. Everyone who has a property which has some flooding shown on it, including me, has that a letter on their property file that's available on their LIM. And so when people are making decisions about their property and making decisions about purchasing land, that information of the existing flooding potential is available to them. One of the other work streams from that project was looking at what might we be doing about the flooding potential that exists, and there was a real effort to understand a level of service and what role Tauranga City Council should be taking in managing flooding. And so an effort was done there to look at the different approaches we could take. What's come out of that is looking at flooding from a safety-based perspective, so looking at a level of service which is defined not just based on depth, but based on the product of depth and velocity, because those two together are what can create a hazard to people living in that area. So Tauranga has adopted a depth velocity-based trigger, and that's an example of the map on the right, which is showing the same area, not depth, but the product of depth and velocity. And so that process is being used to drive the current program of works looking at managing flooding in Tauranga. And I've got colleagues who are busy working on that project and are doing really good work in some of these areas, looking at potential interventions to mitigate or reduce the risk that exists in those current areas and move people out of flooding areas or mitigate the hazard that exists. So that's sort of the work that's been done to date, and a lot of that work is still ongoing. At the moment, there's a lot of drivers and a lot of growth happening in Tauranga, and there's a lot of planning context that we need to deal with for things like our future infrastructure planning and our city planning. So some of the things that are going on at the moment is Tauranga needs to be growing out. There's a huge amount of population growth and people moving to Tauranga, so there's a need for us to be developing new communities, and when we're doing that, they need to be resilient communities, and so we need to understand the hazards there and the management of stormwater and flooding. As well, within the city, there are also some pieces of land which haven't been developed yet, and those are starting to become developed with the pressures of growth, and there's a perception sometimes that those are the worse areas or the harder areas, so there's a particular focus on management of flooding in those areas as well. Alongside growing out, we also want to grow up and grow more dense to accommodate the growing population and to make efficient use of the area, so that's something that we're really keen to promote, but at the same time understanding if we're promoting more intense development, how do we make sure that that's not having adverse effects or that that's not exposing more people to an existing hazard and making the situation worse. On top of that, there's also the work that's being done around climate change, and you will have heard that in some presentations this morning, and so when we're doing our planning, we need to be considering future timeframes. We look at least a 100-year time period in our planning, and also cumulative effects over time as well, so that what we're doing is resilient because it's going to be in place for a very long time. And these things are all not just what Tauranga City Council thinks is a good idea, but this is all underpinned and directed by a lot of regional and national policy statements at the moment. So we've got national policy statements on freshwater, on urban development capacity as well, regional policy statements on risk assessment and management. So these are all things that we're needing to consider and give effect to at the same time. So all of this is leading towards a proposed plan change to the city plan. There's also regular reviews of the city plan, but there's a particular plan change proposed to look at the effects of intense rainfall related flooding, and particularly in a natural hazards respect. And so unlike some of the physical intervention works that are ongoing as well, this is looking at a planning approach with the aim of reducing risk over time. So that when people are undertaking new developments, that they're doing so in a way that avoids as much as possible creating risks to people, but also when there's redevelopment cycles going on within the city, that is reducing risk over time as well, so we're continuously improving. And while we're doing this as well, also considering the other changes that are happening over this time period as well, such as climate change, and such as the cumulative effects of all of this development ongoing and infilling impervious services happening across the city. So the things that are being looked at in that respect are parts of the city plan that Tauranga controls around land use and subdivision, and reflecting some of the flooding drivers and issues in those plans, so that it's upfront and clear to people and to council when we're looking at making these decisions. A large part of that process, which is where Claudia and I are involved in supporting, is mapping associated with this. So the mapping is intended to build on what we've already got and help with the interpretation of all of these planning drivers and rules, but also really telling the story of the system and showing people how the land and water system is really working and connected, not just in the development but across the city. So we've just got a really kind of rough initial example of some of the features that are being considered as part of this work, and some of the features that we think might be worth highlighting or protecting and giving focus on, and making that clarity through the planning rules. So for context, this area here is what we were just talking about. In terms on the left, that's the Kopererua Valley, and the city area being what we call Te Papa Peninsula, from sort of Gate Park, Greaton, all the way up to the CBD. So this is a really raw example of some of the mapping that we've been looking at, and we've had consultants here helping us with that as well. So what we've got currently is maps that show depth, and so that is proposed to continue. Obviously that's an important feature that we need to be aware of and managing. So in terms of areas which are blue, showing different depths of water potential in an intense rainfall event, so that when people are developing or planning, they're aware that there's potential for water there, and we can have responses appropriately, such as floor levels, and making sure that there's people are not at risk of flooding in that case, of flooding their dwellings. The other feature that we're looking at on top of this to help really explain and show how the system works is some of the purple areas. So these are based on not just where there's water, but where there's particularly flowing water. So these would be our flow paths, part of the system. And we really want to show those and highlight the importance of those so that when there is development occurring, people are not inadvertently placed in one of those, exposing them to risk, or people aren't inadvertently changing those and sending water to their neighbours or somewhere else that might not otherwise have been, and creating new risks. So we're hoping to do through some mapping some awareness of the connectivity of these, where they are, and making sure that they're given the respect, I guess, that they need to make sure that that function continues. You'll see that some of the purple areas are connecting into what I've coloured teal at this stage, and some of our large areas. So this is what might be considered not just flow path, but floodplain, and floodplain of known streams and rivers within the city, such as Kopererua. And those are the really, the large areas which provide significant attenuation and are significantly flooded, as well as all the other features that we've been hearing about. So from a flooding and plan perspective, those may be given additional weight as well, those real floodplain parts of the city. So what might this all mean, I guess, for including in the city plan and for developments going forward? In my opinion, it's nothing radical, but it's about providing space for water within developments. And so that by providing space for the water, it's protecting people from the hazard that that water might create. And also about considering the effects of any development on the land and water system, so that they're not worsening existing or creating new effects on others, and creating changes that we might not be able to predict or control. And I was going to include some examples of this, but I thought that given it's been a water sensitive design seminar today, you've spent the whole day hearing about examples, because this is really taking a water sensitive design approach, which is also incorporating that into flood risk by providing space and allowing for water and being sensitive to water. We're also addressing the hazard effects of that. So I wanted to reiterate, I guess, that this is not about controlling or preventing necessarily flooding. I've heard that before as well. We don't need to consider flood effects because council controls flooding or council prevents flooding and there's no flooding. This is really about making sure that it's recognised and acknowledged and given appropriate weighting and respect, so that when developments are occurring, this is taken into account. And as I was going through preparing for this presentation, I was asked to talk about flooding, so the first thing I did was try and find some cool pictures of flooding. And these were just two examples that I found are very close to each other in the 2013 floods, that just show the two different, I guess, approaches how people might interact with flooding after an event, depending on where it is. And so the effect on networks and effect on systems can be quite different depending on where the flooding is located, but we still have flooding, and it's about allowing for that. So that's some of the work that is going on through the city plan team at the moment. We're also looking at how we might incorporate some of these ideas into our planning and also into our plan reviews and future work going forward. And so this is one of the ideas and approaches that's being used at the moment, is not just when new development is occurring, potentially in greenfield areas, but also if we're looking at intensifying and developing and master planning areas of the city where we really want to encourage growth and new development. At the same time, we're planning for our transport corridors and our infrastructure corridors. What if we planned for water corridors as well, and blue-green corridors potentially? So areas where there might be flooding, areas where there might be growth. Is there a way that we could reconnect those areas, provide for the water, provide for the flooding, reduce hazard, and also potentially bring in some of those other benefits that we've been talking about today? So that's something that we might be looking at in future, as well as trying to really promote and actively engage in that planning of corridors. I've whizzed through that, but if there's any questions, happy to sort of talk about the direction that we're going.